The boarding house door slammed so hard it rattled the glass. Clara's final words echoed in Griffinshaw's ears as he knelt beside the bed, his hands still clutching hers though they'd grown cold hours ago. It's not your fault. This is God's will. Don't lose your faith. Her voice had been paper-thin by the end, parched from fever. Beside her, 6-year-old James lay motionless, his small face peaceful at last after days of suffering. They'd gone within hours of each other, his wife and Tom stolen by the fever that had swept through Valley Springs like wildfire. Griffin's medical bag sat open on the floor, instruments scattered around him like fallen soldiers. Useless. All his training, his Harvard education, his years of practice, worthless in the face of this enemy. "Where were you?" he whispered. Then louder, "Where were you?" The Bible on the nightstand seemed to mock him. With a sudden, violent motion, Griffin seized it and hurled it against the wall. Pages fluttered like broken wings as it fell. In that moment, de Griffenshaw died alongside his family. What remained was merely a shell, a ghost walking among the living. 3 years later, winter 1882. The Wyoming winter settled over the hills like a shroud. Griffin stood on the ridge above Valley Springs, watching smoke rise from chimneys in thin gray columns against the darkening sky. Snow would fall tonight. He could smell it in the air, feel it in the ache of the old bullet wound in his shoulder, a souvenir from his brief service as a field medic during the war. Through his spyglass, he observed the town he'd once called home. The church steeple, the bank, the general store, places he now avoided like plague houses. His eyes caught movement near the boarding house. A wagon loaded with trunks, a woman and 3 children being turned away despite the gathering storm. Mrs. Jenkins stood rigid in the doorway, her face set in righteous disapproval. Even from this distance, Griffin recognized that expression. He'd seen it often enough in the years since Clara and James died, the same expression townsfolk wore when they passed him on his infrequent trips for supplies. The heretic doctor, the man who cursed God. Griffin lowered the spyglass and turned away. Not his concern. He had wood to chop before the storm hit. Yet something made him look back. The woman was climbing onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins. The smallest child was coughing visibly even at this distance. "Not my concern," Griffin muttered, eyes drifting to the twin graves visible from his cabin porch. The graves he tended with religious care, though he had abandoned religion itself. Still, the sight of that coughing child nagged at him as he descended the slope toward his cabin. Some habits died harder than faith. Ruth McKenna felt the town's eyes on her back as she guided the wagon down the muddy main street of Valley Springs. Every door had closed at the mention of her name. Every window had curtains that twitched, then fell still. "Ma," Joseph whispered from beside her on the seat, his 11-year-old voice trying to sound strong. "Where will we go?" Ruth had no answer. Her oldest son had grown too perceptive, too serious since his father's death. He saw through her brave smiles, her reassurances. Behind them, Nathan huddled under a thin blanket with Matthew, whose cough grew worse by the hour. "We'll find shelter past the ridge," she said, knowing it for the lie it was. The temperature was dropping rapidly. The wind carried ice in its breath. Through the frosted window of the bank, Garrett Harrison watched her pass, his eyes calculating behind gold-rimmed spectacles. The town's judge and banker, 2 positions that gave him more power than the mayor. Ruth had felt his gaze at the funeral, assessing what Patrick had left behind. Land, debt, a widow with 3 sons. Beside the bank, Reverend Fletcher emerged from the church, his severe face lifting toward the darkening sky. "Reverend," Ruth called, pulling the wagon to a halt. "Please, just for tonight. My youngest is ill." The Reverend regarded her without warmth. "Your husband died with whiskey on his breath and a gun in his hand, Mrs. McKenna. Not living according to the Lord's ways." He glanced at the gathering clouds. "Perhaps this is a time for reflection on your circumstances." "My sons have done nothing wrong," Ruth said, her voice tight. "Children bear the weight of their father's sins," Fletcher intoned, turning away. "The church cannot be seen encouraging such arrangements." Arrangements. As if her widowhood were somehow improper. As if poverty were a moral failing rather than misfortune. Ruth flicked the reins, urging the exhausted horse forward. They were a mile outside town when the first heavy snowflakes began to fall. 2 miles when the wind rose to a howl. 3 when Matthew's fever spiked high enough that his small body shuddered against her. The wagon became harder to control as snow accumulated. The trail grew indistinct. The horse stumbled, then refused to move further. Night had fallen completely now, and with it, any hope of finding proper shelter. Ruth tucked the blanket more tightly around Matthew, whose breathing had grown labored. Joseph climbed down to check the horse's legs, while Nathan quietly wept beside his younger brother. "Stay here," Ruth told the boys, taking the lantern. "I'll look ahead. Maybe there's a homestead nearby." But the swirling snow obscured everything beyond a few feet. Ruth felt the panic rising in her throat. Patrick had left them nothing but debt and a patch of land too far from town to reach tonight. She had no family within 500 miles. That was when she felt it, the prickling sensation of being watched. Ruth turned slowly, one hand sliding beneath her coat to the small revolver she kept tucked in her waistband. A figure on horseback materialized from the darkness. Tall, broad-shouldered, silent as the falling snow. The rider stopped 30 feet away, regarding them without movement. Ruth drew the gun. "I have nothing worth stealing," she called, her voice steady despite her fear. "And I know how to use this." The rider dismounted. As he approached, the lantern light revealed his face, a man in his late 30s with dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. His face might have been handsome once, but grief had carved deep lines around his mouth and between his brows. His eyes were the pale blue of winter ice. His gaze moved past Ruth to the wagon where Matthew's coughing had intensified. "That child needs medicine," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. "Immediately." "Who are you?" Ruth demanded, the gun still raised. Something flickered across the man's face. Irritation, perhaps, or resignation. Someone who doesn't want another death on his conscience. He glanced up at the thickening snow. "You can follow me or freeze here. Your choice." Ruth hesitated. Every instinct warned against trusting a stranger in the wilderness. Yet Matthew's wheezing breaths left her no real option. "Joseph," she called, "help me with the horse." Griffin's cabin stood on a forested slope overlooking a frozen creek. A plain structure built of solid timber, it had weathered enough Wyoming winters to prove its worth. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, promising warmth inside. Ruth noticed two things immediately: the small fenced graveyard behind the cabin and the absence of any barn. Her host led their exhausted horse to a lean-to shelter attached to the main structure. "Bring the boy inside," he ordered, securing the animal. The cabin's interior was warm but Spartan. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Bookshelves lined another, packed with volumes whose gilded titles spoke of medicine and science. A desk in the corner held papers and an unlit lamp. Everything was meticulously organized, scrubbed clean, except for a fine layer of dust on the mantelpiece, as if the owner cleaned from necessity rather than pride. Griffin Shaw, for that was the name Joseph had spotted on a medical bag half hidden beneath the desk, moved with efficient purpose. He dragged a canvas sheet across the room, dividing the space. "Boys by the fire," he said. "Mrs. McKenna," Ruth supplied. "Ruth McKenna." "Mrs. McKenna, there's a bed through there." He nodded toward the curtained area. "I'll sleep in the lean-to." Before Ruth could respond, he had crossed to a small door, secured with a padlock. He opened it with a key from his pocket, disappearing inside for a moment before emerging with a wooden box of supplies. Ruth caught a glimpse of the room, shelves of bottles, equipment, and what appeared to be children's toys before he closed and locked it again. "Your son," Griffin said, turning to Matthew, who lay shivering in Joseph's arms. "How long has he been ill?" "The cough started 3 days ago, the fever today." Griffin knelt beside Matthew, his hands gentle but clinical as he examined the boy. He pressed a stethoscope to the small chest, listening intently. Ruth watched his face, the focused concentration, the slight furrow between his brows. For a moment she glimpsed the physician he must once have been. "Bronchitis, verging on pneumonia," he said finally. "He needs medicine, warmth, and rest." He began unpacking supplies from the box: tinctures, powders, bandages. His movements were practiced, methodical. This was a man who had done this many times before. "Are you a doctor?" Joseph asked, watching intently. Griffin's hands paused almost imperceptibly. "Once." He mixed a powder with water and held it to Matthew's lips. "Drink, boy." Matthew turned his face away, frightened by the stranger. "Matthew," Ruth said softly, "this medicine will help you feel better. Please try." When the child still resisted, something changed in Griffin's demeanor. He set the medicine aside and reached into his pocket, producing a small wooden horse, intricately carved. "This was my son's," he said, his voice softening slightly. He didn't like medicine either, but he was brave enough to take it. Matthew's eyes fixed on the carved horse. Slowly, he allowed Griffin to help him drink the bitter mixture. When he'd finished, Griffin pressed the wooden toy into his small hand. "Keep it for now," he said, then turned to Ruth. "He'll need more in 4 hours. Wake me if his breathing worsens." With that, Griffin gathered a blanket and stepped outside, leaving Ruth and her sons in the suddenly quiet cabin. "Ma," Nathan whispered, his 8-year-old face solemn in the firelight, "is Matthew going to die like Pa did?" Ruth gathered her middle son close. "No, sweetheart. Mr. Shaw is helping him." "Mr. Shaw," Joseph corrected, studying the cabin with sharp eyes. "Harvard Medical School, it says on his bag. What's a Harvard doctor doing here?" Ruth had no answer. She tucked her sons near the fire and retreated to the curtained area. The bed was neatly made, the blankets clean but worn. A small table beside it held a single book, a Bible, its leather cover cracked and faded. When she opened it, an inscription inside read, "To Griffin, with all my love, Clara." Through the frost-edged window, Ruth could see the small graveyard. 2 crosses stood side by side, visible even through the falling snow. She thought of her own husband's grave, unmarked, hastily dug behind the saloon where he'd died in a drunken brawl over cards. Patrick McKenna had been charming once, full of dreams and promises. Then had come the drinking, the gambling, the fists that Ruth had learned to dodge. In the end, she'd mourn not his death, but the man he'd been before the whiskey took him. Ruth closed the Bible and lay down, listening to Matthew's labored breathing and the howling wind. In the lean-to, she imagined the doctor, the stranger who had saved them from the storm, lying awake as well, haunted by whatever ghosts had driven him to this lonely mountainside. The night grew worse. The storm intensified, rattling the cabin shutters and sending drafts whistling under the door. Around midnight, Matthew's fever spiked dangerously. He thrashed in delirium, his small face flushed, his breathing rapid and shallow. Ruth tried the medicine Griffin had left, but Matthew couldn't swallow. His lips had taken on a bluish tinge that terrified her. "Joseph," she whispered urgently, "run and get Mr. Shaw." Joseph pulled on his coat and slipped outside. Moments later, the door burst open. Griffin entered in a swirl of snow, his face grim as he assessed Matthew's condition. "He's burning up," Ruth said, her voice cracking. "He can't breathe properly." Griffin's response was immediate. He gathered supplies, working with methodical urgency, cool cloths for Matthew's forehead, a steam treatment for his lungs, a different tincture administered a drop at a time. "Hold him up," Griffin directed Ruth. "He needs to be elevated to breathe easier." Ruth cradled her son against her chest while Griffin listened to his lungs. Matthew's small body burned against her like a coal. "Will he—" She couldn't finish the question. "I won't lose him," Griffin said, and there was something in his voice, a fierce determination that went beyond professional duty. His hands, Ruth noticed, trembled slightly as he measured more medicine. Hours passed. The storm raged outside while they fought a different battle within. Joseph and Nathan eventually succumbed to exhaustion, curling up by the fire. Ruth remained awake, holding Matthew while Griffin monitored his breathing, adjusted his treatment, bathed his burning forehead. In the darkest hour before dawn, Matthew began to convulse. "Hold him steady," Griffin commanded, his voice tight with controlled urgency. The seizure lasted less than a minute, but to Ruth it stretched into eternity. When it ended, Matthew lay unnaturally still. "He's not breathing," Ruth gasped. Griffin moved with sudden, decisive action. He tilted Matthew's head back, pressed his mouth to the boy's, and breathed for him. Once, twice. Then he placed his hands on the tiny chest and pressed in a careful rhythm. "Come on," he whispered. "Come back, son." Matthew remained motionless. "Come on, James," Griffin said, his voice breaking. "Take my hand." The slip didn't register with Ruth immediately. She was focused entirely on her son's still face. Then Matthew gave a shuddering gasp, drew a ragged breath, and began to cough weakly. Relief washed over Ruth like a physical wave. Griffin sat back on his heels, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. For a moment, his professional mask slipped, revealing naked vulnerability. "Thank you," Ruth whispered, gathering Matthew's limp form against her. "Thank you." Griffin didn't respond. He checked Matthew's pulse, listened to his lungs, and adjusted the blankets around him. His movements were mechanical now, as if he operated on the last reserves of his strength. "The crisis has passed," he said finally. "His fever is breaking." Dawn was creeping through the windows, gray light seeping around the edges of the shutters. The storm had subsided, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. "You called him James," Ruth said quietly. Griffin froze, his back to her. She could see tension lock his shoulders. "My son," he said after a long moment. "That was my son's name." He gathered his medical supplies with quick, efficient movements. "He'll sleep now. So should you. I'll check on him in a few hours." Before Ruth could respond, Griffin had disappeared through the door, closing it firmly behind him. Through the window, Ruth saw him trudge through deep snow to the twin graves at the edge of the clearing. He stood there motionless, head bowed, as the first light of day spilled over the eastern ridge. When Ruth woke later that morning, Griffin was gone. Matthew slept peacefully, his fever reduced, his breathing easier. Joseph and Nathan had taken it upon themselves to explore the cabin, careful to stay away from the locked room. "Ma, look what Nathan found," Joseph whispered, showing her a yellowed telegram he'd discovered beneath the pillow on the sofa. Ruth hesitated. It felt like an invasion of privacy, but curiosity overcame her scruples. The message was brief. "Fever outbreak in Valley Springs. Do not return. P. McKenna." The date sent a chill through her. 3 years ago, during the epidemic that had claimed nearly 20 lives in Valley Springs. The same epidemic that, judging by the dates on the grave markers outside, had taken Griffin Shaw's family. "P. McKenna," Joseph read over her shoulder. "That was Pi." Ruth's mouth went dry. Patrick had never mentioned sending such a telegram. But then there were many things Patrick hadn't told her. "Put it back exactly where you found it," she told Nathan. "This isn't our business." But it was their business, in a way she couldn't yet comprehend. Some connection between her dead husband and this grieving doctor had brought them to this cabin on this night. Ruth rose and went to the window. Griffin was nowhere to be seen, but fresh tracks in the snow led toward the forest. She dressed quickly and stepped outside, drawing her coat tight against the biting cold. The graveyard was a simple affair, a small plot encircled by a wooden fence. The crosses were handmade but carefully crafted, the names carved with painstaking precision. Clara Shaw, beloved wife and mother, 1845 to 1879. James Shaw, our perfect joy, 1873, 1879. Ruth knelt beside them, brushing snow from the bases where Griffin had laid winter berries and pine branches. Not the neglected graves of forgotten dead, but tended with devotion. "He was a doctor." Ruth started at Griffin's voice behind her. He stood several yards away, arms laden with firewood, his expression unreadable. "You were the doctor here in Valley Springs," she said, understanding dawning. "During the epidemic." "I wasn't here." His voice was flat, emotionless. "I was in Cheyenne purchasing supplies for my practice. When I returned, they were already buried." Ruth stood slowly. "I'm sorry. 19 people died. The nearest other doctor was 2 days' ride away." He shifted the wood in his arms. "Your son is awake. He's asking for you." He walked past her toward the cabin. Ruth remained a moment longer, looking at the graves. The connection hovered at the edge of her understanding. Patrick's telegram, the epidemic, Griffin's absence. Some terrible confluence of events that had shattered this man's life and somehow touched her own. Back inside, she found Matthew sitting up, drinking broth that Griffin had prepared. The boy's eyes were clearer, his color improved. "Mama," he said, "Dr. Griffin gave me soup and said I was brave like his boy." Ruth smiled, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "You are very brave." Griffin was arranging his medical supplies, his back to them. "The storm has passed, but the trail will be impassable for at least a day. You are welcome to stay until it's clear." The words were stilted, formal, a doctor's clinical assessment rather than a genuine invitation. Yet compared to his initial coldness, it represented a thaw. "Thank you," Ruth said. "We'll try not to impose longer than necessary." Griffin nodded once, then took his coat and left again. Through the window, Ruth watched him return to the forest, axe over his shoulder. There was something methodical in his movements, as if physical labor were a form of penance. "Ma," Joseph said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "The telegram. Pa was supposed to warn Dr. Shaw about the fever, wasn't he?" Ruth closed her eyes briefly. Joseph had always been too perceptive for his age. "I don't know, Joseph. Your father?" She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Your father wasn't always reliable with important tasks." Joseph's face hardened. At 11, he remembered more of Patrick's failings than his younger brothers. "He was probably drunk, wasn't he? Or gambling." "Joseph, it's why Dr. Shaw's family died, isn't it? Because Pa didn't send the warning in time." Ruth had no answer that wouldn't confirm her son's suspicions or require her to lie. Instead, she pulled him close, feeling the thin shoulders that carried too much understanding for his years. "Sometimes terrible things happen that no one can prevent," she said at last. "And sometimes people make mistakes with consequences they never imagined. All we can do is try to be better than we were yesterday." Joseph didn't respond, but his gaze remained on Griffin's distant figure, swinging the axe with mechanical precision against the endless winter. The day passed quietly. Ruth kept Matthew resting, but allowed Nathan and Joseph to help with small tasks: melting snow for water, sweeping the cabin floor, folding the linens Griffin had used during the night. The doctor himself remained outside most of the day, returning only to check on Matthew and prepare a simple stew for their evening meal. As dusk fell, Griffin finally joined them at the table. He ate mechanically, responding to Nathan's curious questions about the books on his shelves with brief but not unkind answers. "Were you a soldier, doctor?" Nathan asked, pointing to a faded uniform jacket hanging near the door. "Field medic." Briefly, Griffin's eyes remained on his bowl. "Near the end of the war." "Our grandpa was a soldier," Nathan continued, oblivious to the tension Ruth sensed building in their host. "Ma says he got shot at Gettysburg, but a kind doctor saved him." Griffin's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Is that so?" Ruth nodded. "My father was with the 12th Pennsylvania. He spoke often about the field hospital, said it was hell on earth, but the medics were angels in the midst of it." Something flickered in Griffin's eyes. A brief spark quickly extinguished. "There were no angels at Gettysburg," he said. "Only men trying desperately to stem the tide of death." He set down his spoon. "Excuse me." He rose and went to the locked room, unlocking it and disappearing inside. Through the briefly opened door, Ruth glimpsed shelves of medical supplies and what appeared to be children's furniture. Joseph watched the door close with narrowed eyes. "He keeps his son's room locked," he whispered to Ruth, "like a shrine." "That's his business," Ruth murmured, though she too found it troubling. This man who tended graves religiously but locked away his memories. Later, after the boys were asleep, Ruth found herself unable to rest. She sat by the fire, mending Nathan's worn shirt by the flickering light. The cabin door opened, and Griffin entered, dusting snow from his coat. He paused, seeing her awake. For a moment, it seemed he might retreat again. Instead, to her surprise, he hung his coat and sat in the chair opposite her. "Your son is improving," he said. "His lungs are clearing well." "Thanks to you." Griffin shook his head slightly. "I merely provided what was needed. His body did the healing." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the soft sound of Ruth's needle through fabric. Outside, the wind whispered around the eaves. "You were a doctor in Boston," Ruth said finally, nodding toward a framed certificate partially visible on his bookshelf. "Harvard Medical School." Griffin's jaw tightened. That was another life. "Why Valley Springs? It seems an unlikely place for a Harvard graduate." He was quiet so long Ruth thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was low, measured. "Clara, my wife, grew up in Wyoming. She wanted James to know wide skies and open spaces, not just city streets." His fingers traced an invisible pattern on the arm of his chair. "I had a successful practice in Boston, but she missed home. So I sold the practice, bought land here, and set up as the town doctor." You gave up everything for her. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It didn't feel like sacrifice. It felt like adventure. Ruth nodded, understanding completely. She had once followed Patrick with similar optimism, leaving behind her father's home for the promise of a new life. And then the epidemic came, she said softly. Griffin's face closed again. Yes. I'm sorry about the telegram, Ruth said, the words escaping before she could reconsider. About Patrick, my husband. Griffin went still. What do you know about that? Ruth set aside her mending. Nothing specific, but I know Patrick was unreliable, especially if he'd been drinking or gambling. If he was supposed to warn you, it doesn't matter now. Griffin stood abruptly. It was 3 years ago. It matters to you, Ruth said. You're still living with it, still punishing yourself. You know nothing about me, Mrs. McKenna. His voice had gone cold. I know grief, she replied steadily. I know what it is to be betrayed by someone you trusted. And I know what it is to keep moving forward for the sake of children who depend on you. Griffin looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing past her worn clothes and work-roughened hands to something beneath. For a moment, Ruth thought he might speak from that deeper place. Instead, he retreated behind his walls. Get some rest, Mrs. McKenna. You and your sons have had a difficult journey. He took a lantern and went to his desk, effectively dismissing her. Ruth watched him a moment longer, the rigid set of his shoulders, the careful way he arranged his papers, before returning to the curtained sleeping area. Through a crack in the curtain, she observed him open a drawer and remove what appeared to be a journal. He wrote for several minutes, his face illuminated by the lantern's glow. There was pain in that profile, but something else too. A flicker of the man he had been before tragedy rewrote his story. Ruth closed her eyes, listening to the scratch of his pen against paper. In the darkness behind her lids, she saw Patrick's face, flushed with drink, promising tomorrow would be different. She saw Judge Harrison's calculating eyes at the funeral, assessing what he might claim of her husband's debts. She saw the town turning its back as night fell, and her child burned with fever. And she saw Griffin Shaw standing in the snow between two graves, bent but not broken by the weight he carried. Morning would bring decisions. The trail would clear, and they would need to leave. Ruth had no illusions about what awaited them in town. Judge Harrison's generosity in offering to buy her land for a fraction of its worth to settle Patrick's debts. Reverend Fletcher's conditional charity that required penitence for sins she hadn't committed. For tonight, at least, her children were safe and warm. Matthew was healing. That would have to be enough. Valley Springs lay under a blanket of pristine snow, the main street quiet in the aftermath of the storm. Inside the imposing brick building that housed both the bank and the county offices, Judge Garrett Harrison reviewed documents spread across his mahogany desk. The McKenna property, he mused, tapping a survey map with one manicured finger. 40 acres along the proposed railway line, essential for the right-of-way. Across the desk, Reverend Samuel Fletcher shifted uncomfortably. The widow refused your offer? She hasn't had the good sense to accept it yet. Harrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. But circumstances will persuade her. The debts her husband accumulated are substantial. And legitimate? Fletcher asked, then immediately regretted the question when Harrison's gaze sharpened. Are you questioning my integrity, Reverend? Fletcher tugged at his collar. Of course not. I merely wondered if there might be a more charitable approach. The woman has 3 young sons, after all. Harrison leaned back in his chair. Your concern for their welfare is commendable. Perhaps the church might offer assistance after she's relieved of the burden of that worthless land. The implication was clear. Fletcher had his own secrets, his own compromises with the powerful banker. He had learned long ago that in Valley Springs, Harrison's will became town policy, with the church's moral authority deployed as needed to support it. She wasn't at the boarding house this morning, Fletcher said. No one's seen her since the storm. Find her, Harrison said, returning to his papers. Winter has just begun. A widow with hungry children will soon see reason. As Fletcher left, Deputy Wyatt Carter entered, snow still melting on his shoulders. The young lawman removed his hat, revealing sandy hair and a face too gentle for his profession. Judge Harrison, he began hesitantly, I've been reviewing some of the paperwork on the McKenna debts, and there are some irregularities. Are there indeed? Harrison interrupted, his voice dangerously soft. How fortuitous that we have such a diligent deputy. Tell me, how is your sister's health these days? I understand the treatment in Denver is quite expensive. Wyatt paled slightly. She's improving, sir, thanks to your loan. Wonderful news. Harrison smiled thinly. I'm sure you'll want that improvement to continue. Now, about those irregularities. Perhaps you misunderstood some legal terminology. I'd be happy to clarify anything confusing. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Wyatt swallowed hard and replaced his hat. Must have been my mistake, sir. Sorry to trouble you. No trouble at all. Harrison returned to his papers. Oh, and deputy, when you find the McKenna woman, let me know immediately. Wyatt nodded and retreated, his shoulders slumped beneath the weight of compromise. Outside, he paused on the bank steps, looking toward the mountains where the McKenna wagon had headed into the storm. He hoped, for Ruth McKenna's sake, that she had found shelter far from Valley Springs and its tangled web of power and debt. The second day at Griffin's cabin brought subtle shifts. Matthew's condition improved enough that he could sit up and take broth. Nathan discovered a chess set in a cabinet and convinced Griffin to teach him the game. Joseph remained watchful, his young face serious as he observed the interactions between his mother and their reluctant host. Ruth noticed changes in Griffin as well. His movements seemed less mechanical, his face less shuttered. When he examined Matthew, his hands were gentle, and once she caught the ghost of a smile when the boy asked about the wooden horse. Did your boy like horses? Matthew asked innocently. Griffin's hands paused in their examination. He did. He wanted to be a cowboy when he grew up. He tucked the blanket around Matthew. Rest now. Your lungs are healing well. As he rose, Ruth saw raw pain in his eyes, quickly masked. She followed him to the main room where he was packing away his stethoscope. Thank you, she said quietly. Not just for the medicine, but for answering him. I know it must be difficult. Griffin didn't look up. Children deserve honest answers. Yes, they do. Ruth hesitated. Dr. Shaw, I'm not a doctor anymore, he interrupted. I haven't practiced medicine in 3 years. You practiced it last night, she pointed out. You saved my son's life. His shoulders tensed. One case doesn't erase 3 years of silence. Perhaps it's a beginning. Griffin finally looked at her, his blue eyes troubled. Mrs. McKenna, don't mistake necessity for redemption. When the trail clears tomorrow, you and your sons should return to town. Is that what you want, Ruth asked, for us to leave? The question hung between them, unexpectedly intimate. For a moment, something flickered in Griffin's expression. Vulnerability quickly suppressed. What I want ceased to matter 3 years ago, he said finally. What matters is what's sensible. You need a proper roof, not a hermit's cabin. Your sons need education, community. Valley Springs hasn't exactly welcomed us with open arms, Ruth said wryly. Even so, you can't hide from the world forever. His gaze drifted toward the window, toward the graves beyond. Trust me on that. Before Ruth could respond, a knock at the door startled them both. Griffin frowned. Clearly, visitors were rare, and opened it cautiously. Deputy Wyatt Carter stood on the threshold, his young face reddened from cold. Dr. Shaw, he said, removing his hat. Sorry to intrude. I'm looking for Mrs. McKenna and her children. There's a storm coming, and folks are concerned. Griffin's expression hardened. Are they indeed the same folks who turned them away during the last storm? Wyatt had the grace to look ashamed. Not everyone agrees with how things were handled. Mrs. McKenna and her sons are here, Griffin said. The boy was ill. They'll return when the trail is safe. Wyatt's relief was visible. Thank you, sir. I'll let people know they're safe. He hesitated. Sir, there's something you should know. Judge Harrison is very interested in finding Mrs. McKenna. He's claiming her land for debts owed. That's between Mrs. McKenna and the judge. It's not that simple. Wyatt lowered his voice. The judge has methods, and he wants that land badly. It's on the planned railway route. Ruth had approached the door in time to hear this last exchange. My land for the railway? Wyatt started, noticing her for the first time. Mrs. McKenna, yes ma'am. Judge Harrison has been negotiating with the railroad company for months. Your 40 acres are key to the route they want. Ruth's mind raced. Patrick had always insisted that worthless scrap of land would someday be valuable. It seemed he'd been right about something after all. Thank you, Deputy, she said. When we return, I'll deal with Judge Harrison directly. After Wyatt departed, Ruth turned to find Griffin watching her with a thoughtful expression. "You didn't know about the railway," he said. "No," Ruth shook her head. "Patrick always said we needed to hold on to that land, but I thought it was just another of his dreams." "Judge Harrison is not a man to be trusted," Griffin said. "He's been buying up property along the proposed route for years, using the bank to pressure owners." "You seem well informed for someone who avoids town." A muscle worked in Griffin's jaw. "Isaiah Freeman rides up occasionally with supplies and news. He's the blacksmith in Valley Springs, one of the few honest men left there." Ruth considered this new information. The land was her only asset, her only hope of providing for her son's future. If Harrison wanted it badly enough to send the deputy searching after a snowstorm, it was worth far more than he'd offered. "I won't sell," she said firmly. "Not to Harrison." Griffin's expression darkened. "He won't give you a choice. He'll find ways to force the issue, calling in debts, turning the town against you. He's done it before." "Then I'll fight back," Ruth declared. "I've faced worse than a small-town judge with delusions of grandeur." Something shifted in Griffin's eyes. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Your determination is admirable," he said. "But Harrison has the law, the church, and the town on his side. It would be a difficult battle even for someone with resources." "Are you suggesting I surrender?" "I'm suggesting you consider all options carefully. Sometimes retreat is the wiser strategy." Ruth studied him. This man who had retreated to the mountains, who locked away his grief behind padlocked doors. "Is that what you did, Dr. Shaw? Retreat wisely?" Griffin turned away. "No, Mrs. McKenna, I ran like a coward. There's a difference." He took his coat and left the cabin, the door closing firmly behind him. Through the window, Ruth watched him make his way to the graves, where he stood with bowed head as snow began to fall once more. The following morning brought another storm. The trail remained impassable, forcing Ruth and her sons to extend their stay. Griffin accepted this development with resigned hospitality, retreating to his desk where he wrote in his journal for hours, occasionally consulting medical texts from his bookshelf. Joseph, ever curious, tried to glimpse what the doctor was writing. "It's a letter," he whispered to Ruth. "He writes every day, but never sends them." "Joseph," Ruth scolded gently, "that's private. Leave Dr. Shaw his dignity." But later, when Griffin left to check his snares in the forest, Joseph couldn't resist investigating further. He discovered a small wooden box beneath Griffin's bed, its lid carved with the name Clara. "Ma, look," he called softly. Ruth hesitated, torn between respect for their host's privacy and her own curiosity about this enigmatic man. "We shouldn't," she said, but found herself approaching nonetheless. The box contained dozens of folded papers, letters, all addressed to Clara Shaw. Joseph carefully opened one, dated just a week earlier. "Clara, another winter descends. The silence grows deeper with each passing season. I continue my research on pulmonary infections, though there is no one here to benefit from it. Old habits, I suppose. Sometimes I imagine returning to medicine, to the world of the living. Then I remember your face and James's, and how I failed you both. The town grows and changes without me. Isaiah says the railway is coming, bringing progress and prosperity. You would have been pleased. You always believed in the future of this place. I miss your faith. In Ma, in humanity, in me. I've lost all three, I fear. Always yours, Griffin." Ruth felt a wave of sadness. 3 years of letters to a dead woman, not delivered to her grave, but kept in this box like secrets too painful to release. "Put it back," she told Joseph, "exactly as you found it." Joseph obeyed, but his expression remained troubled. "Ma, does he blame Pa for what happened, for not sending the telegram in time?" Ruth sighed. "I don't know, Joseph, but I think mostly he blames himself." "But it wasn't his fault." "Grief isn't rational," Ruth said softly. "When we lose someone we love, we look for reasons, for someone to blame. Sometimes the easiest person to blame is ourselves." Joseph fell silent, absorbing this. Finally, he asked, "Do you blame yourself for what happened with Pa?" The question caught Ruth off guard. "What do you mean?" "For not leaving sooner, for staying even when he hurt you." Ruth gathered her eldest son close, surprised at his perception. "Oh, Joseph, sometimes I do. I wonder if I could have protected you boys better, or helped your father find his way back to the man he once was." She stroked his hair. But I'm learning that regret doesn't change the past. We can only move forward. Joseph nodded against her shoulder. I think Dr. Shaw needs to learn that too. From the mouth of a child, Ruth thought, such simple wisdom. Later that evening, as another snowstorm raged outside, an unexpected peace settled within the cabin. Matthew felt well enough to join them at the table for a simple supper of rabbit stew. Nathan convinced Griffin to play chess again, chattering happily about strategies his father had taught him. At the mention of Patrick, Griffin's expression tightened momentarily, but he continued the game without comment. Ruth watched the interaction, noting how Griffin gradually relaxed as Nathan's innocent enthusiasm wore down his reserves. After the boys were asleep, Ruth found herself alone with Griffin by the fire. He had taken out his journal again, but seemed more contemplative than focused on writing. Your sons are resilient, he said unexpectedly. Children often are, Ruth replied, more than we give them credit for. Griffin nodded slowly. James was like that, adaptable, curious. Clara used to say he could find adventure in an empty room. A faint smile touched his lips at the memory. Ruth recognized the moment for what it was, a precious gift, this voluntary sharing of his past. Tell me about them, she said softly, if you want to. Griffin was silent so long Ruth thought he would refuse. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, reflective. Clara was from Wyoming originally. Her father ran the general store in Laramie. She came east for schooling, that's where we met, at a medical lecture in Boston. She wasn't supposed to be there. Women weren't admitted to the program, but she disguised herself and slipped in. His expression softened. She was brilliantly stubborn. She sounds remarkable. She was. She assisted in my practice, though unofficially, had a better diagnostic instinct than half the doctors I knew. Griffin's fingers traced the edge of his journal. James was born in Boston, but Clara always wanted him to know Wyoming, the mountains, the open spaces. So we came here. And you built a life, Ruth said gently, for a while. Griffin's face clouded. I was in Cheyenne when the fever hit, purchasing equipment for my practice. By the time I returned, he trailed off, his gaze fixed on the fire. I'm sorry about Patrick's telegram, Ruth said. My husband had many failings. Reliability was certainly one of them. Griffin looked up, his eyes troubled. Mrs. McKenna, I don't blame your husband, not entirely. The responsibility was mine. I should have been here. You couldn't have known. Perhaps not, but I've had 3 years to consider all the ways I might have saved them. He closed his journal. It's late. You should rest. Ruth recognized the dismissal, but found herself reluctant to leave this moment of connection. Dr. Shaw, she said standing, thank you for sharing them with me. Griffin nodded once, his gaze returning to the fire. As Ruth turned to go, he spoke again. Griffin, he said quietly, my name is Griffin. Ruth smiled, feeling a small but significant shift between them. Good night, Griffin. In the curtained sleeping area, Ruth lay awake, listening to the storm. She thought of the letters in the wooden box, of a man who spoke to ghosts because the living were too painful to face. She thought of Patrick, who had failed this family in ways he would never comprehend. And she thought of her sons, especially Joseph, carrying burdens too heavy for his young shoulders, the knowledge of his father's failings, the responsibility he felt toward his brothers. Outside, the wind moaned around the cabin's eaves, a lonely sound in the wilderness night. But inside, for the first time in months, Ruth felt a flicker of something like hope. Not a solution to their problems, not a clear path forward, but a reminder that even in the depths of winter, human connection remained possible. She fell asleep to the soft scratch of Griffin's pen against paper, wondering what he wrote to Clara tonight, and whether it might contain some mention of the living who had unexpectedly entered his solitary world. The days stretched into a week as winter tightened its grip on the mountains. Each morning, Griffin would announce that the trail might soon be passable. Each afternoon, fresh snow or biting wind would render the journey to town too dangerous to attempt. This cycle of almost departure created a strange limbo, a temporary life that began to feel increasingly permanent. Ruth watched as the cabin transformed subtly around them. Matthew's drawings appeared on the wall beside the fireplace. Nathan's chess set migrated from the cabinet to a permanent position on the small table by the window. Joseph split wood alongside Griffin, the two working in companionable silence. Most striking was the change in Griffin himself. The rigid, mechanical movements had softened. He spoke more, smiled occasionally, brief flickers that vanished quickly but revealed glimpses of the man he had been. He still visited the graves daily, still wrote his letters to Clara, but there was something different in his bearing, as if he stood slightly more upright beneath his burden. One afternoon, Ruth found him showing Matthew how to use a stethoscope, patiently explaining how the heart's chambers created different sounds. "Like this?" Matthew asked, pressing the instrument to Griffin's chest with solemn concentration. "That's right," Griffin said. "What do you hear?" "Boom, boom, boom, boom." Matthew's face lit with wonder. "It's talking." Something crossed Griffin's face, pain and pleasure so intertwined they became indistinguishable. "That's exactly what James used to say." He looked up, meeting Ruth's gaze, and for once didn't turn away from the emotion visible there. Later, Ruth discovered Griffin had begun teaching Joseph basic medical principles: how to clean a wound, set a simple splint, recognize symptoms of common illnesses. "Your son has an aptitude for medicine," Griffin told her as they prepared supper. "A natural diagnostician's mind." Ruth smiled. His grandfather was a medic in the war. He used to show Joseph his old field kit, teach him the names of instruments. Griffin's hands paused in slicing bread. "The 12th Pennsylvania, you said?" "Yes, he was at Gettysburg, Antietam, the Wilderness. Said those years aged him 20. War medicine is—" Griffin seemed to search for words. "It changes how you see the human body, its resilience and its fragility." He said much the same. Ruth studied Griffin's profile. "You were very young for a field medic." 21, fresh from medical school, certain I could save everyone." A shadow crossed his face. "I learned otherwise quickly enough." Their conversations had begun to follow this pattern, moments of openness followed by retreat, like waves advancing and receding on a shore. Yet each time the wave reached slightly further inland before pulling back. The locked room remained a mystery until Matthew's cough returned one night. It wasn't as severe as before, but the sound carried Griffin back to that first critical evening. Without hesitation, he unlocked the forbidden door to retrieve medicine from his supplies. In his haste, he left the door ajar. Ruth, bringing a cool cloth for Matthew's forehead, glimpsed the interior illuminated by Griffin's lamp. It was a child's bedroom, preserved like a museum exhibit. A small bed with a patchwork quilt, shelves lined with books and wooden toys, a rocking horse in one corner, a child-sized desk where papers and drawing implements lay as if their owner had just stepped away momentarily. Griffin turned, medicine in hand, and saw Ruth standing in the doorway. His face hardened. "This room is private," he said, his voice cold as he moved to close the door. "I'm sorry," Ruth said, stepping back. "I didn't mean to intrude." Griffin administered the medicine to Matthew in silence. His earlier warmth vanished behind a wall of icy reserve. When Matthew was sleeping peacefully again, Griffin disappeared outside despite the late hour and falling snow. Ruth found him an hour later standing by the graves, snow accumulating on his shoulders like a shroud. "You'll freeze out here," she said, approaching cautiously. "It doesn't matter." His voice was distant. "It matters to my sons," Ruth countered. "They've grown fond of you." Griffin laughed bitterly. "Then they're fools, as you are." "Perhaps." Ruth pulled her shawl tighter against the cold. "Or perhaps they recognize a good man who's lost his way." "I haven't lost my way, Mrs. McKenna. I've chosen it deliberately." "You've chosen to stop living because they did." The words were harsh, but Ruth's tone remained gentle. "Is that what Clara would have wanted?" Griffin turned on her, anger flashing in his eyes. "Don't presume to know what Clara would have wanted." "I know what any mother would want," Ruth replied steadily. "No mother wishes her child's death to destroy the father's life as well." Griffin's anger crumbled, leaving something more vulnerable exposed. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't live in a world where they don't exist." "Yet here you are," Ruth said softly, "breathing, healing, teaching. Those are acts of the living, Griffin." He shook his head, snow falling from his hair. "Those are echoes, habit, nothing more." Ruth stepped closer, close enough to see the frost forming on his eyelashes. "When you saved Matthew, was that just habit? When you teach Joseph about medicine, is that merely an echo? Griffin had no answer. He stood motionless, snow swirling around them both in the lantern light. Come inside, Ruth said finally. Please. After a long moment, Griffin nodded once and followed her back to the cabin. Inside, he removed his snow-covered coat and sat heavily by the fire, staring into the flames. Ruth prepared tea, moving quietly to avoid waking the boys. When she handed Griffin a steaming cup, his fingers brushed hers, ice cold from his vigil in the snow. I keep their room exactly as it was, he said suddenly, his voice low, as if they might return at any moment. Ruth sat across from him. I understand. After Patrick died, I kept finding things I couldn't discard. His razor, his favorite shirt. Did you love him, despite everything? The question surprised her. Ruth considered it honestly. I loved who he was when we married. That man disappeared long before he died. Griffin nodded slowly. Clara was the best of me. When I lost her and James, I lost my center, my purpose. You were a doctor, a healer. That purpose still exists. A doctor who couldn't save his own family. Griffin's laugh was hollow. What kind of healer does that make me? A human one, Ruth said simply. Griffin looked up, meeting her gaze directly. Something passed between them, a recognition of shared pain, of wounds still raw beneath hastily applied bandages. The room, he said after a long silence. James's room. I can't bring myself to change it. You don't have to, Ruth assured him. Not until you're ready. And if I'm never ready, the question hung between them, laden with deeper meaning. Ruth chose her words carefully. Then it remains as it is. But Griffin, there's a difference between honoring memory and being imprisoned by it. He considered this, turning the teacup in his hands. When I saw your son that night, sick, struggling to breathe, it was like seeing James again. I couldn't fail another child. You didn't fail James, Ruth said gently. Disease did, circumstance did. If I had been here, you might have died alongside them, Ruth interrupted. The fever took trained doctors in other towns. Clara knew that. She wouldn't blame you. Griffin's eyes glistened in the firelight. How can you be so certain? Because I've read her words to you, Ruth admitted. Joseph found your Bible, the inscription. Griffin reached for the book on the mantelpiece, opening to the first page where Clara's handwriting flowed across the paper. To Griffin, with all my love, may your compassionate heart always find joy in healing others, as you have healed mine. Clara. She saw the healer in you, Ruth said. Not just the husband or father, the man who saved others. Griffin traced the words with his finger, as if trying to absorb some essence of his wife through the faded ink. I've forgotten how to be that man. No, Ruth shook her head. You've just forgotten how to forgive him. Griffin closed the Bible carefully, but didn't return it to the mantelpiece. Instead, he kept it in his hands, a tangible link to a past he'd been both preserving and avoiding. It's late, he said finally. You should rest. Ruth recognized the retreat, the protective withdrawal. But something had shifted tonight, some first crack in the ice that had encased Griffin for 3 long years. She stood, respecting his need for space to process. Good night, Griffin, she said, pausing at the curtain to the sleeping area. Thank you for sharing them with me. After she had gone, Griffin remained by the fire, Bible in hand, listening to the wind and the soft breathing of the sleeping children. For the first time in years, he opened the book, turning to a page marked with a Preston flower, a mountain columbine, Clara's favorite. The passage was underlined in her hand. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. He read it twice, then closed the book and held it against his chest like a shield, or perhaps a key to a door long locked. The next morning, Ruth woke to find Griffin teaching Nathan how to properly measure ingredients for biscuits. The boy was covered in flour, laughing as Griffin demonstrated the technique with exaggerated precision. 3/4 cups exactly, Griffin was saying solemnly. Baking is science, Nathan. Accuracy matters. Is that why your biscuits taste like rocks? Nathan asked innocently. Instead of offense, Griffin's response was a short bark of laughter, a rusty sound, as if long unused. Exactly why. I never mastered this particular science. Ruth remained in the doorway, unwilling to interrupt this moment. Griffin sensed her presence and looked up, something new in his eyes. A tentative warmth, an acknowledgement of their nighttime conversation. "Good morning," and he said. "We're attempting breakfast. Success is not guaranteed." "I can see that," Ruth replied, smiling at the disaster of flour covering the table. "Perhaps I could assist?" "Please," Griffin said with exaggerated relief. "Save us from ourselves." When the domesticity of the scene struck Ruth suddenly, this makeshift family gathering in a kitchen on a snowy morning, the easy laughter, the simple task shared. For a moment, the weight of their circumstances lifted, allowing a glimpse of what might be rather than what had been. Later, as Griffin checked Matthew's lungs with his stethoscope, the boy asked innocently, "Griffin, is Mama going to marry you?" Griffin's hands froze. Ruth, sitting nearby, felt heat rise to her face. "Matthew," she began, embarrassed. "No, it's all right," Griffin said, recovering his composure. "Matthew, your mother and I are friends. Sometimes adults can be friends without marrying." Matthew considered this. "But you look at her like Pa used to look at her, before he got mean." The simple observation hung in the air between them. Griffin carefully removed the stethoscope, his movements deliberate. "Your lungs sound much better," he said, expertly redirecting. "No more medicine needed, I think." But later, when the boys were occupied with chores, Griffin approached Ruth as she mended clothing by the window. "I apologize for Matthew's question," he said quietly. "Children have no filter." "No need to apologize," Ruth replied, keeping her eyes on her stitching. "He's trying to make sense of our situation." Griffin nodded, his gaze drifting to the window where Joseph was clearing snow from the path. "Mrs. McKenna, Ruth, I should be clear. I can't offer." "I'm not expecting anything," Ruth interrupted gently, finally looking up at him. "Neither of us is ready for whatever this might be. We're both still healing." Relief in something more complex crossed Griffin's face. "Yes, exactly. But," Ruth continued, setting aside her sewing, "I think perhaps we can help each other heal, as friends." Griffin considered this, his expression softening. "I'd like that," he said finally. "I've been alone with my ghosts for too long." When the admission seemed to surprise him as much as her, this acknowledgement that his isolation had been a choice, and perhaps not the right one. Before either could speak further, a knock at the door interrupted them. Griffin frowned, moving to answer it. Isaiah Freeman stood on the threshold, his broad shoulders dusted with snow, his dark face creased with concern. "Isaiah," Griffin said, genuine pleasure warming his voice. "Come in. What brings you up the mountain in this weather?" The blacksmith entered, removing his hat to reveal gray-streaked hair. His eyes found Ruth, and he nodded respectfully. "Mrs. McKenna, glad to see you and your boys safe." He turned back to Griffin. "Thought you should know there's trouble brewing. Judge Harrison's been asking questions about your guests. Sent Deputy Wyatt looking for them again yesterday." Griffin's expression darkened. "What kind of questions?" "About debts, mostly. Claims Patrick McKenna owed the bank substantial money." Isaiah glanced at Ruth apologetically, also suggesting it's improper for a widow to stay with an unmarried man. Ruth felt anger rise in her chest. "That's sanctimonious." "There's more," Isaiah interrupted grimly. "Harrison's been meeting with railroad men. Your land sits right where they want to build, Mrs. McKenna, and they're willing to pay handsomely, just not to you." Griffin's jaw tightened. "He's trying to force Ruth to sell by calling in Patrick's debts." Isaiah nodded, "and using the church to add moral pressure. Reverend Fletcher delivered quite the sermon yesterday about maintaining proper appearances." Ruth felt ill. The town that had already rejected her was now being turned further against her, all for a piece of land she'd never even valued until now. "What about the debts?" she asked. "Are they legitimate?" Isaiah exchanged a look with Griffin. "Deputy Wyatt's been asking the same question. Carefully, mind you. But there are whispers that some of Patrick's markers have been enhanced after the fact." "Fraud," Griffin said flatly. "Hard to prove without the originals," Isaiah replied, "and those are locked in Harrison's office." Ruth sank into a chair, overwhelmed. "What am I supposed to do? I can't fight the bank, the church, and the town." Griffin paced the small room, his earlier warmth replaced by cold anger. Harrison has overplayed his hand. Using the church as a weapon, falsifying debts, he's vulnerable. Isaiah nodded slowly. Maybe, but he's also powerful. Controls most businesses in town through loans. Reverend Fletcher won't cross him. Why? Ruth asked. What hold does Harrison have over a minister? The two men exchanged glances again. Fletcher has a past, Isaiah said carefully, before he found religion. Harrison knows about it. So we're facing corruption, blackmail, and fraud, Ruth summarized bitterly. All for 40 acres of scrubland Patrick insisted would someday be valuable. Griffin stopped pacing, a determined expression settling on his face. Isaiah, we need to know exactly what debts Harrison is claiming. Can you find out? The blacksmith nodded. Wyatt might help. He's not comfortable with what's happening. Good, and we need to establish Ruth's clear ownership of that land. The deed is recorded at the county office? Should be. I'll check. Ruth watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. What are you doing? Griffin turned to her, something of the old doctor's decisive competence in his bearing. Making a diagnosis. Harrison's disease is greed complicated by arrogance. The treatment is exposure. For the first time since Patrick's death, Ruth felt a flicker of hope, not just for keeping her land, but for finding allies in this battle she'd assumed she would fight alone. Why would you help me? She asked Griffin. This isn't your fight. Griffin's expression softened. Perhaps it's time I had a fight again, something worth fighting for. The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight beyond their immediate context. Isaiah cleared his throat. I should head back before the snow gets worse. I'll gather what information I can. After the blacksmith departed, promising to return in 2 days, Ruth found Griffin standing at the window, watching Isaiah's figure disappear into the swirling snow. You don't have to involve yourself, she said quietly. This is my battle. Griffin turned to face her. For 3 years, I've hidden on this mountain, nursing my grief like a precious possession. Meanwhile, men like Harrison have been free to corrupt everything my wife loved about this town. His voice grew stronger. Clara believed in justice, in community, in helping others. I've dishonored her memory by retreating from those values. Ruth was struck by the transformation in him, subtle yet profound. The man who had greeted them so coldly a week ago was being gradually replaced by someone more alive, more present. What if we lose? She asked. Griffin's smile was grim but determined. Then we lose fighting. That's better than surrendering without a struggle. He moved to his desk and began writing rapidly, making notes and calculations. Ruth watched him, this awakening man, and felt something stir within her that she had thought long dead. A dangerous emotion for a widow with 3 children and uncertain prospects. Hope was perilous enough. This new feeling was far more treacherous. That evening, after the boys were asleep, Ruth found Griffin at his desk, surrounded by papers, medical journals, old correspondence, notes in his precise handwriting. What are you doing? She asked, bringing him a cup of tea. He accepted it gratefully. Research. Harrison's corruption didn't begin with your land. I've been compiling instances where he's used the bank to pressure people into selling property along the proposed railway road. Ruth sat across from him. How long have you been tracking this? Griffin looked slightly embarrassed. 3 years. Isaiah brings news. I make notes. It was academic, I suppose. Something to occupy my mind. And now? Now it might be useful. He shuffled through papers. Harrison's been methodically acquiring land for the railway since before I lost Clara and James. He was pressuring the Wilsons to sell their farm when the fever hit. Ruth frowned. You think there's a connection? Griffin hesitated. I've wondered. The timing of the epidemic was convenient for several of Harrison's land deals. People in mourning make poor negotiators. The implication was staggering. You can't think he deliberately... Ruth couldn't even complete the thought. No, not deliberately caused the epidemic, but perhaps took advantage of it. Griffin's expression was troubled. The telegram Patrick was supposed to deliver to me. I've always wondered why it was delayed. Ruth felt cold despite the fire's warmth. You think Harrison intercepted it? I don't know, but Patrick worked at the telegraph office occasionally, didn't he? When he needed extra money? Ruth nodded slowly. Yes, he would fill in when Mr. Simmons was ill. That's how he knew about the fever outbreak before most people. Griffin leaned forward, and Harrison would have known that a doctor returning might help contain the epidemic, reducing its impact. Reducing the number of desperate sellers, Ruth concluded, following his logic. She shook her head. It seems monstrous. Power corrupts, Griffin said simply, and Harrison has held unchecked power in Valley Springs for too long. They sat in silence, contemplating the weight of these suspicions. Finally, Ruth spoke. If this is true, if Harrison somehow delayed your return during the epidemic, then Patrick wasn't entirely responsible for my not being here when Clara and James fell ill, Griffin finished. I've considered that possibility for years, never able to prove or disprove it. He sighed heavily. In truth, it changes nothing. They're still gone. Ruth reached across the desk, covering his hand with hers. But it might change how you live with that loss. Griffin's eyes met hers, vulnerability evident in their blue depths. Perhaps. But first, we need to focus on protecting your land and your future. The "we" wasn't lost on Ruth. This commitment to her cause from a man who had shunned all connection for years. His hand turned beneath hers, their fingers intertwining briefly before he gently withdrew. I should continue this research, he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. Ruth stood, understanding his need for space. Good night, Griffin. As she moved toward the curtained sleeping area, his voice stopped her. Ruth. He seemed to struggle with what to say next. Thank you for bringing life back into this cabin. The simple acknowledgement moved her deeply. Thank you for sheltering us when no one else would. That night, Ruth lay awake, listening to Griffin moving about the cabin, the occasional rustle of papers or creak of his chair. She thought about Harrison and his schemes, about Patrick's possible role in the tragedy that had shattered Griffin's life, about the complex web that had brought her family to this mountain cabin. Most of all, she thought about the man beyond the curtain, a good man finding his way back from grief's deepest valley, awakening to purpose and connection once more. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. Within, something equally transformative was occurring, the slow thaw of hearts long frozen. Morning brought clear skies and bitter cold. Griffin announced at breakfast that the trail to town would likely be passable by afternoon. We'll go tomorrow, he said, not meeting Ruth's eyes. Isaiah should return today with more information. Joseph watched this exchange with perceptive eyes. Are we coming back? He asked directly. The question hung in the air, laden with implications that extended beyond their temporary shelter. Griffin hesitated, glancing at Ruth. That depends on your mother, he said carefully. Ruth felt the weight of multiple gazes, Joseph's intensity, Nathan's hopeful expression, Matthew's wide eyes, and Griffin's carefully neutral face that couldn't quite mask his own investment in her answer. We need to face what's waiting in town, she said diplomatically. But yes, Joseph, I expect we'll return here until matters are settled. Relief visibly passed through Griffin, though he quickly masked it by turning to tend the fire. Joseph nodded, seemingly satisfied, while Nathan cheered openly and Matthew rushed to hug Griffin's legs. I knew it, the little boy exclaimed. I told Joseph we wouldn't leave forever. Griffin awkwardly patted Matthew's head, his expression a complex mixture of discomfort and pleasure. Yes, well, you're welcome here as long as necessary. The words were stiff, formal, but Ruth saw beyond them to the man struggling to accommodate these unexpected emotions after years of isolation. Later, while the boys were outside helping Griffin clear snow, Ruth found herself drawn to the locked room, James's room. The door remained firmly shut, but it called to her nonetheless, this physical representation of Griffin's walled-off heart. She didn't attempt to enter. Instead, she ran her fingers lightly over the wooden surface, understanding more fully what it represented. Not just grief, but guilt. The belief that by moving forward, by finding new joy, he would somehow betray those he had lost. Ruth knew something about that guilt. She had felt it the first time she laughed after Patrick died, the first morning she woke without immediately remembering her loss, the insidious voice that whispered, "How dare you live while they cannot?" A sound behind her made Ruth turn. Griffin stood at the cabin entrance, snow melting on his shoulders, watching her with an unreadable expression. I wasn't trying to enter, she said quickly. I know, he interrupted, his voice surprisingly gentle. I've been thinking about what you said. about the difference between honoring memory and being imprisoned by it. He crossed to stand beside her, both of them facing the locked door. I haven't entered this room in nearly 3 years, he admitted. I locked it 2 days after the funeral and have only opened it to dust, never staying longer than necessary. Why? Ruth asked softly. Griffin's voice grew distant, as if speaking from that time. Because I could still smell him there. James, that little boy's smell of soap and dirt and innocence. I was afraid if I stayed, if I touched his things, that last trace would vanish. His breath caught, and then he would truly be gone. Ruth's heart ached for him, this man who had transformed loss into a science of preservation, as if by keeping everything unchanged, he might somehow prevent time from carrying him further from those he loved. They're already gone, Griffin, she said gently, but you're still here. He nodded slowly, extracting the key from his pocket. For a breathless moment, Ruth thought he might unlock the door. Instead, he held the key out to her. I can't do it yet, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But someday, perhaps. Ruth understood what he was offering. Not access to the room, but acknowledgement of the possibility of change, of healing. She closed his fingers back around the key. When you're ready, she assured him, there's no schedule for grief. Griffin pocketed the key, his expression lightening slightly. My rational mind knows that. The rest of me is slower to accept it. That's being human, Ruth said simply. A flicker of a smile touched his lips. I've been avoiding that condition for some time now. How's that working out for you? Ruth asked, matching his lighter tone. Poorly, Griffin admitted, particularly since a certain stubborn widow and her sons invaded my sanctuary. The teasing note in his voice was new, a glimpse of the man he might have been before tragedy struck. Ruth felt herself responding to him, with a warmth that both thrilled and frightened her. Before she could reply, a knock at the door announced Isaiah's return. The blacksmith entered, stamping snow from his boots, his expression grave. Harrison's making his move, he said without preamble. He's called a town meeting for tomorrow to discuss moral concerns about Mrs. McKenna's situation, and he's filed papers to claim her land for debt repayment. Griffin's momentary lightness vanished, replaced by focused determination. What did you discover about the debts? Isaiah removed his gloves, warming his hands by the fire. Wyatt did some digging. The original loan to Patrick McKenna was for $50. Harrison's claiming it's now $500 with interest. That's impossible, Ruth protested. Even Patrick couldn't have accumulated that much interest. Exactly, Isaiah nodded. The documents have been altered. Wyatt compared the handwriting on the ledger to other entries. The original 50 has clearly been changed to 500. Griffin's expression hardened. Can Wyatt testify to this? Isaiah grimaced. That's the problem. Harrison has leverage over him. His sister's medical treatment in Denver. Harrison arranged the financing. So we have suspicions, but no proof, Griffin summarized. Not quite. Isaiah reached into his coat, producing a folded paper. I found the deed to Mrs. McKenna's land in the county records. It's clear and unencumbered. Patrick paid for it outright 5 years ago. Ruth took the document with trembling hands. But how could Harrison claim it for debt repayment if there's no lien against it? Because most people don't fight back, Griffin said grimly. They trust the banker, the judge. They don't check records or challenge figures. Isaiah nodded. And those who do find themselves facing the combined pressure of the bank, the church, and social ostracism. Ruth studied the deed. Tangible proof that at least one thing Patrick had told her was true. The land was theirs, free and clear. So what do we do? She asked, looking between the two men. Griffin took the deed, examining it carefully. We prepare for battle. Tomorrow we go to town. The remainder of the day passed in preparation. Griffin gathered documentation of Harrison's questionable dealings over the years. Isaiah provided information about other landowners who had been pressured to sell along the railway route. Ruth organized her own papers, Patrick's death certificate, their marriage license, documents proving her legal right to the property. As evening fell, the boys sensed the tension in the cabin. Joseph remained quiet and watchful, while Nathan asked endless questions and Matthew became clingy, refusing to leave Ruth's side. Will the mean judge take our home? Matthew asked, as Ruth tucked him into bed. Ruth smoothed his hair back from his forehead, now cool and healthy thanks to Griffin's care. No, sweetheart, we won't let that happen. Dr. Griffin will help us, right? He's brave like a knight. Ruth smiled at the childish assessment. Yes, he's helping us. Now sleep, my love. When the boys were finally asleep, Ruth joined Griffin and Isaiah at the table, where they were finalizing their strategy for the town meeting. Harrison will try to make this about morality, not money, Isaiah warned. He'll use Reverend Fletcher to shame you publicly. Ruth's jaw tightened. Let him try. I've done nothing wrong. The town may not see it that way, Griffin said gently. Valley Springs can be provincial in its thinking. Then I'll face their judgment, Ruth declared. I've faced worse. Griffin studied her with admiration. Your courage is remarkable. Isaiah glanced between them, a knowing expression crossing his weathered face. I should head back before it gets too late. I'll see you both at the meeting tomorrow. After the blacksmith departed, promising to spread word among sympathetic townsfolk, Griffin and Ruth sat in silence by the fire. The enormity of tomorrow's confrontation weighed heavily upon them. Are you certain you want to involve yourself in this? Ruth asked finally. You've avoided town for 3 years. This will thrust you into the center of attention. Griffin stared into the flames, his profile etched in golden shadow. I've hidden long enough. Clara would be ashamed of what I've become. This ghost on the mountainside, watching injustice from afar. He turned to face her, his expression resolute. Tomorrow isn't just about your land, Ruth. It's about whether Valley Springs remains the community Clara loved or becomes Harrison's personal kingdom. Ruth was moved by his conviction, this resurrection of purpose, in a man who had abandoned all causes save grief. What if we fail? She asked again. Griffin's response was different this time. Then we fail together, but we won't have surrendered without a fight. The simplicity of his answer, the solidarity it offered, touched Ruth deeply. For so long she had faced her challenges alone. Patrick's drinking and gambling, his death, the struggle to feed and shelter her children. The promise of not facing tomorrow's battle in solitude felt like a gift beyond measure. Together then, she agreed softly. Griffin reached across the space between their chairs, his hand finding hers. The touch was brief but deliberate, a sealing of their pact, an acknowledgement of the connection that had grown between them. You should rest, he said. Tomorrow will require all our strength. Ruth nodded and stood, but hesitated before retreating behind the curtain. Griffin, whatever happens tomorrow, thank you for everything. He looked up at her, the firelight catching the silver at his temples, illuminating eyes that no longer resembled winter ice but rather spring skies after rain. It is I who should thank you, Ruth McKenna, he said, his voice low and sincere. You and your sons woke me from a long, cold sleep. Ruth felt her heart quicken at his words, at the naked emotion in his usually guarded face. For a dangerous moment, she considered crossing the space between them again, acting on the current that had been building since that first night by Matthew's sickbed. Instead, she smiled gently and withdrew behind the curtain, knowing that tomorrow held challenges enough without adding the complication of feelings neither of them was fully ready to acknowledge. In the quiet darkness, Ruth listened to Griffin moving about the cabin, banking the fire, checking the locks, his footsteps pausing briefly outside the curtain before continuing to his own bed. The familiar sounds had become comforting in so short a time, creating an illusion of permanence that tomorrow might shatter completely. Outside, the mountain stood silent under stars, the twin graves barely visible as darker shadows against the snow. Within the cabin, 4 souls slept while a 5th kept vigil, his journal open before him, pen hovering over paper as Griffin Shaw considered what words to write to his dead wife on this night before he re-entered the world of the living. Clara, he finally wrote, tomorrow I return to town for the first time since losing you. Not for myself, but for a family who needs an ally against injustice. I think you would approve. I think you would say, it's time. The woman, Ruth, she reminds me of you sometimes. Not in appearance or manner, but in her strength, her fierce protection of her children, her willingness to see good in a broken man. I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but for the first time in 3 years, I find myself looking toward the future rather than the past. Is that a betrayal? Or is it, perhaps, what you would have wanted all along? I miss you. I will always miss you and James. But I begin to think that honoring your memory might mean living fully rather than merely existing. Always yours, Griffin. He folded the letter carefully, placing it in the wooden box with all the others. This nightly conversation with ghosts that had sustained him through the wilderness of grief. Then he extinguished the lamp and lay down, listening to the soft breathing of the sleeping family beyond the curtain and wondering what tomorrow would bring when he finally stepped back into the world he had abandoned. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Griffin stood on the cabin porch, watching the sunrise with a mixture of determination and apprehension. Today he would return to Valley Springs, to the community he had abandoned, to the whispers and stares, to the ghosts that lingered on every street corner. The sound of the door opening behind him announced Ruth's presence. She joined him at this railing, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Beautiful morning," she said softly. Griffin nodded, deceptively so. Ruth studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. "Second thoughts?" "No." His response was immediate and firm. "But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't uneasy about returning." "It's been a long time," Ruth acknowledged. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Griffin's precise accounting revealed how he had marked each day of his exile. He turned to face her, his expression resolute. "But it's time." Inside the cabin, they could hear the boys stirring, Nathan's cheerful chatter, Joseph's quieter responses, Matthew's sleepy questions. The sounds of family life that had, in just 2 short weeks, transformed Griffin's solitary existence. "Whatever happens today," Ruth said, "I want you to know that you've already done more than enough for us. If at any point it becomes too difficult—" "It won't," Griffin interrupted. "I made a choice last night. No more hiding." The conviction in his voice stirred something in Ruth. Admiration, yes, but also a deeper emotion she wasn't ready to name. This man who had isolated himself in grief was now willing to face his demons for her family's sake. The gesture humbled her. Preparations for departure were methodical. Griffin packed documents and evidence. Ruth helped the boys dress warmly for the journey. Isaiah had left his larger sled the previous day, allowing them to travel more comfortably than would have been possible in Ruth's weather-beaten wagon. As they prepared to leave, Griffin paused at the cabin door, surveying the space that had been his fortress of solitude. His gaze lingered on James's locked door, then moved to the small touches Ruth and her sons had added. Matthew's drawings tacked beside the fireplace, Nathan's chess set on the table, Joseph's carefully stacked firewood. In 2 weeks they had changed more than the cabin's appearance. "Ready?" Ruth asked gently. Griffin nodded, squaring his shoulders. "As I'll ever be." The journey down the mountain was largely silent. Joseph sat beside Griffin at the reins, watching and learning as the doctor, for he seemed more the doctor today than the recluse, handled the horses with quiet confidence. Ruth held Matthew close, while Nathan pointed out animal tracks in the snow with excited whispers. As they approached the outskirts of town, Griffin's posture stiffened. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The setting of his jaw, the straightening of his spine, the deliberate neutrality that settled over his features like a mask. "Dr. Shaw," Joseph said suddenly, using the formal title for the first time, "are you afraid?" The directness of the question seemed to surprise Griffin. He glanced at the boy, then back at the approaching buildings. "Yes," he admitted quietly, "but fear doesn't need to control our actions." Joseph absorbed this, nodding solemnly. "Pa always said being afraid was weakness." "Your father was wrong," Griffin replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Joseph. It's acting despite fear." Ruth watched this exchange with a full heart. In Griffin, Joseph was finding something he desperately needed, a model of manhood different from Patrick's volatile example. A man who could acknowledge vulnerability without being diminished by it. Valley Springs appeared ahead, smoke rising from chimneys against the winter sky. The main street was busy with morning activity, wagons delivering goods, women hurrying on errands, men gathered outside the general store. The sled's arrival caused an immediate stir. Conversations halted. Heads turned. Recognition dawned on faces as the town registered not just the return of Ruth McKenna and her sons, but the presence of Dr. Griffin Shaw, the hermit of the mountain, the man who had turned his back on community and faith after losing his family. Griffin guided the sled to Isaiah's blacksmith shop at the edge of town, away from the immediate curiosity of the gathering crowd. The blacksmith emerged, nodding and greeting. "Word of the meeting has spread," he informed them in a low voice. "Harrison's called it for noon at the church." "The church," Griffin repeated, his tone hardening. "Of course he has. Using God to do the devil's work," Isaiah agreed grimly. As they unloaded their belongings, Deputy Wyatt Carter approached, his young face troubled beneath his official hat. He nodded respectfully to Griffin before addressing Ruth. "Mrs. McKenna, I'm glad to see you and your boys well." His eyes darted to Griffin. "Dr. Shaw, it's been a long time." "Deputy," Griffin acknowledged with a curt nod. Wyatt lowered his voice. "You should know Judge Harrison is displeased about your return, Mrs. McKenna, and about your choice of accommodation." He glanced meaningfully at Griffin. "My choice of accommodation was limited by the town's hospitality, or lack thereof," Ruth replied evenly. "As you well know." The deputy had the grace to look ashamed. "Yes, ma'am." He hesitated, then added, "Judge Harrison has been meeting with Reverend Fletcher all morning. Whatever they're planning for this meeting, it won't be pleasant." "Thank you for the warning," Griffin said, his tone softening slightly. After Wyatt departed, they followed Isaiah into the warmth of his shop. The blacksmith's living quarters behind the forge were simple but clean, a stark contrast to Griffin's isolated cabin with its air of suspended time. "You can rest here until the meeting," Isaiah offered. "Might be best to stay out of sight until then. Gives Harrison less time to prepare." Griffin nodded agreement, though Ruth could see the tension building in him. He stood by the window, watching the town he had avoided for so long, his expression unreadable. While the boys settled in, fascinated by Isaiah's tools and forge, Ruth approached Griffin. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. He didn't turn from the window. "It's strange. Everything looks exactly the same, yet completely different." "The town hasn't changed," Ruth observed. "You have." This drew his gaze to her. "Perhaps we both have." The hours until the meeting passed with tense preparation. Griffin reviewed their documentation one final time. Isaiah offered insights into which townspeople might support them. Ruth rehearsed what she would say if called upon to defend herself. At 1:45 they prepared to leave for the church. Griffin reached for his coat, then paused, turning to his medical bag, which he had brought along out of habit. After a moment's hesitation, he opened it, removing his stethoscope and placing it around his neck. The simple action seemed to transform him further. The hermit receding, the doctor re-emerging. "Does it feel strange?" Ruth asked, watching this metamorphosis. "Like putting on an old uniform," Griffin admitted. "Familiar yet distant." The boys gathered around, Joseph solemn, Nathan excited by the adventure, Matthew holding tightly to Ruth's hand. Griffin looked at them, this makeshift family that had awakened him, and something resolved in his expression. "Whatever happens," he said, "we face it together." The church stood at the center of town, its white steeple visible from every corner of Valley Springs. As they approached, Ruth could see townsfolk streaming toward it. Merchants, ranchers, mothers with children, the elderly supported by younger family members. News of the meeting had drawn the entire community. At the church steps, Griffin hesitated almost imperceptibly before straightening his shoulders and continuing forward. Ruth knew what this building represented to him. The funeral service for Clara and James, the platitudes that had failed to comfort, the faith he had abandoned in his grief. Inside, the church was nearly full. Their entrance caused a ripple of whispers as heads turned and eyes widened. Griffin's return was clearly the greater shock, his presence beside Ruth creating a buzz of speculation that drowned out even Harrison's carefully orchestrated moral outrage. Near the front, Judge Garrett Harrison sat with Reverend Fletcher, their heads bent in conversation. Harrison looked up at the disturbance, his expression darkening when he spotted Griffin. He leaned closer to Fletcher, whispering urgently. Isaiah led them to seats midway down the aisle, positioning himself protectively on one side of Ruth, while Griffin sat on the other, the three boys between them. Ruth felt the weight of judgment from those around them, the curious stares, the disapproving frowns, the occasional sympathetic glance. At precisely noon, Judge Harrison stood and moved to the pulpit, his imposing figure commanding immediate silence. In his 50s, Harrison carried himself with the confidence of a man long accustomed to power. His tailored suit and gold watch chain spoke of prosperity. His stern expression promised righteous purpose. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice resonating through the church, "thank you for joining us on this important day. We gather as a community to address matters of moral and financial concern, issues that affect not just individuals, but the character and future of Valley Springs itself." Ruth felt Griffin tense beside her as Harrison continued. "As you know, our town has always prided itself on strong values: family, faith, honest dealings. When those values are threatened, it falls to community leaders to take action." Harrison's gaze fixed directly on Ruth. "Mrs. McKenna, would you stand, please?" Ruth rose slowly, her back straight, her expression composed despite the anxiety churning within her. "Mrs. McKenna returned to our community recently, following her husband's unfortunate passing," Harrison continued. "While we sympathize with her situation, certain matters must be addressed. First, there is the question of outstanding debts owed to the bank by the late Mr. McKenna, debts which now fall to his widow." He produced a ledger, opening it with theatrical deliberation. "The sum totals $500, a considerable amount which, I regret to say, necessitates the liquidation of the McKenna property to satisfy creditors." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. $500 was indeed a substantial sum, more than many present earned in a year. "Second," Harrison continued, his voice taking on a graver tone, "there is the matter of moral propriety. It has come to our attention that Mrs. McKenna and her sons have been residing alone with an unmarried man." "That's a misrepresentation," Griffin interrupted, rising to stand beside Ruth. His voice, unused to public speaking after years of isolation, nevertheless carried clearly. "Mrs. McKenna sought shelter during a life-threatening storm after being turned away from establishments in town." Harrison's eyes narrowed at the interruption. "Dr. Shaw, your reappearance is unexpected, though perhaps not surprising, given the circumstances." The implied impropriety hung in the air. Ruth felt her cheeks warm with indignation, but before she could speak, Griffin continued. "If you're suggesting impropriety, Judge Harrison, you should state it plainly instead of hiding behind innuendo." Harrison smiled thinly. "I merely observe that appearances matter in a God-fearing community." "God-fearing?" Griffin's laugh was short and bitter. "Is that what we're calling it now? Tell me, when did God command that widows and children be turned away in winter storms? When did Christ advocate for using debt to seize property from the vulnerable?" Reverend Fletcher stood then, his gaunt face flushed. "Dr. Shaw, your quarrel with the Almighty is well known, but this meeting," Griffin interrupted, "is not about faith or morality. It's about land and money, specifically the McKenna property that Judge Harrison covets for the coming railway." The blunt accusation caused gasps throughout the church. Harrison's face darkened with anger. "How dare you impugn my motives, sir? My only concern is for this community's well-being and the settlement of legitimate debts." "Legitimate?" Griffin reached into his coat, removing a folded document. "This is the deed to the McKenna property, filed with the county 5 years ago. It shows the land was purchased outright, with no liens or mortgages against it." He handed the document to Deputy Wyatt, who had positioned himself near the front. "Deputy, would you confirm this for the assembly?" Wyatt examined the document, visibly uncomfortable as Harrison glared at him. "The deed appears legitimate. It shows the land owned free and clear by Patrick McKenna, now his widow." Harrison dismissed this with a wave of his hand. "The debt was incurred after the purchase. Loans from the bank that were never repaid." $500? Griffin challenged. "For what purpose was such a large sum borrowed?" "That's confidential banking information," Harrison snapped. "Convenient," Griffin retorted, "just as it's convenient that the original loan documents are unavailable for review." Isaiah rose now, his deep voice commanding attention. "I've known Patrick McKenna 15 years. He had many faults, but he valued that land above all else. He wouldn't have borrowed against it, especially not such a sum." Harrison's composure began to crack. "A blacksmith's opinion on financial matters is hardly relevant. Perhaps this is, Griffin countered, producing another document. This is a survey map showing the proposed railway route, a route that cuts directly through the McKenna property, a route that would make that land worth 10 times its current value. The murmurs grew louder as the implications became clear. Harrison's face flushed with anger. You've been in isolation too long, Doctor. You're seeing conspiracies where there are only legitimate business interests. Am I? Griffin's voice grew stronger, more confident with each exchange. Then explain this. He extracted a yellowed paper from his coat. A telegram sent 3 years ago during the fever epidemic, warning me not to return to Valley Springs. Ruth felt her heart pound as Griffin continued. This telegram was supposed to reach me in Cheyenne immediately. Instead, it was delayed by 2 crucial days, days in which 19 people died, including my wife and son. His voice caught briefly before steadying. Days in which Harrison began approaching grieving families about selling their properties. Harrison's face had gone pale. You're suggesting? I'm suggesting nothing, Griffin interrupted. I'm stating plainly that you deliberately delayed that telegram, knowing that without medical attention, the epidemic would claim more lives, lives that represented obstacles to your railway plans. The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. The church had gone completely silent, the assembled townsfolk frozen in shock at the enormity of the charge. Harrison recovered, burst, his voice rising in righteous indignation. This is slander, madness, the ravings of a man broken by grief, living like a hermit, abandoning his duties to this town when we needed him most. The counterattack struck Griffin visibly, reopening old wounds. Ruth saw him falter for the first time, the guilt he had carried for 3 years threatening to overwhelm him. You weren't here, Harrison pressed his advantage, addressing the congregation now. When fever swept through Valley Springs, Dr. Shaw was absent. When children died, when wives and husbands were buried, he was nowhere to be found. And now he returns to cast blame on others for his own failings. Ruth could remain silent no longer. She stepped forward, her clear voice cutting through Harrison's rhetoric. My husband was responsible for delivering that telegram, she said, commanding attention through sheer force of will. Patrick was working at the telegraph office that week. Before he died, he confessed to me that Judge Harrison instructed him to delay the message and paid him to do so. This was not strictly true. Patrick had made no such confession. But Ruth had pieced together enough from Griffin's documentation and her own knowledge of Patrick's weaknesses to make an educated guess. The gamble was calculated. If Harrison had indeed bribed Patrick, his reaction would confirm it. The gamble paid off. Harrison's expression flickered with momentary panic before hardening into outrage. More lies. Your husband was a drunk and a gambler. No one would believe his word over mine. Perhaps not, Ruth agreed calmly, but they might believe this. She nodded to Joseph, who stepped forward with a small, leather-bound book. Patrick's journal, Ruth explained. He recorded his debts meticulously, whom he owed, what he borrowed. There is no mention of any $500 loan from the bank. The largest sum he ever borrowed was $50, which, according to his notes, was repaid 3 months before his death. Joseph handed the journal to Deputy Wyatt, who flipped through it with increasing concern. Furthermore, Ruth continued, there are entries about the telegraph office and payments received for special handling of messages, including one on the date of the epidemic warning. Harrison's composure cracked entirely. This is absurd, a convenient journal appearing at the perfect moment. Who would believe such an obvious fabrication? I would, came a new voice from the back of the church. Heads turned as Eliza Simmons, wife of the telegraph operator, stood from her seat. My husband suspected something wasn't right about that message to Dr. Shaw. Patrick was acting strangely, kept the telegram locked in his desk overnight, instead of sending it immediately as protocol required. And I, added another voice, Tom Wilson, whose farm adjoined the McKenna property. After my wife died in the epidemic, Harrison was at my door the very next day with an offer on my land. Said I'd need money for the funeral. Seemed mighty prepared, considering. More voices joined in, testimonies of pressure to sell, of debts mysteriously increasing, of coincidences that, when laid side by side, formed a damning pattern. Harrison looked around wildly, watching his carefully constructed facade crumble. His gaze landed on Reverend Fletcher, silently demanding support. The Reverend stood slowly, his face ashen. For a long moment he seemed to wrestle with some internal conflict. Then, to everyone's surprise, he turned not to Harrison, but to the congregation. "I have failed as your spiritual leader," he said, his voice wavering. "I have allowed myself to be used as an instrument of greed rather than an instrument of God's love and justice." The confession stunned the assembly into silence. Harrison's expression shifted from disbelief to fury. "Fletcher, have you lost your mind? Think carefully about what you're doing." The implied threat hung between them, but Fletcher seemed beyond intimidation. "I'm thinking clearly for the first time in years, Garrett. Whatever you know about my past, whatever hold you think you have over me, it's nothing compared to the judgment I'll face for my silence." He turned to Ruth, then to Griffin. "I ask your forgiveness, both of you." Before either could respond, Harrison made a desperate final play. "This is all conjecture and hearsay. There is no proof I interfered with any telegram, no proof the debts aren't legitimate. The word of a hermit doctor, a widow of questionable character, and a blacksmith counts for nothing against established records." "Perhaps this will count for something," Deputy Wyatt said quietly, stepping forward. From his vest, he withdrew a folded paper. "This is the original loan agreement between Patrick McKenna and the bank. The amount is clearly $50, not $500. Harrison's face drained of color. "Where did you get that?" "From your office safe," Wyatt admitted. "After Mrs. McKenna returned to town, I began to question the figures you were claiming. I've suspected for some time that you've been falsifying documents. When I found this, I knew for certain." Harrison lunged for the document, but Wyatt stepped back, keeping it out of reach. The motion was so sudden, so uncharacteristically violent for the dignified judge, that it confirmed his guilt more definitively than any testimony. "You'll regret this, Wyatt," Harrison snarled. "Your sister's treatment in Denver is already paid for," Isaiah interrupted. "The community took up a collection last week. Sarah doesn't need your blood money anymore." Harrison looked around the church, seeing former allies turning away, former supporters regarding him with disgust. His carefully constructed kingdom was collapsing around him. With a final venomous glare at Griffin and Ruth, he pushed past Wyatt and strode down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the silent church. The door slammed behind him with a finality that seemed to mark the end of an era in Valley Springs. In the silence that followed, Griffin turned to Ruth, his expression a mixture of disbelief and relief. They had won, not just preserved her land, but exposed a corruption that had poisoned the community for years. Reverend Fletcher cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the pulpit. "This meeting was called to address matters of morality and community," he said, his voice stronger now. "Perhaps we have indeed done so, though not in the manner originally intended." He looked at Ruth, then at Griffin. "Mrs. McKenna, Dr. Shaw, on behalf of Valley Springs, I offer my deepest apologies. We failed to provide Christian charity when you needed it most. We allowed fear and prejudice to override compassion." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation, many looking ashamed at their participation in Harrison's schemes. "As for the question of propriety," Fletcher continued, "I see before me a woman of strength and dignity who has protected her children through unimaginable circumstances. And I see a doctor who, despite his own profound loss, extended shelter and healing when others turned away." He smiled faintly. "If there is impropriety in such actions, then perhaps our understanding of morality needs re-examination." The meeting dissolved into smaller gatherings as townsfolk approached Ruth and Griffin, some to apologize, others to share their own experiences with Harrison, many simply to welcome Ruth properly to the community she had been denied entry to. Through it all, Griffin remained by her side, though Ruth could sense his discomfort with the attention. This public reemergence, this confrontation with the town that held so many painful memories, had taken a toll on him. Yet beneath the strain, she saw something new emerging, the return of purpose, of connection. When they finally escaped the church, retreating to Isaiah's shop with the boys, Griffin seemed simultaneously exhausted and invigorated. "You did it," Ruth said, watching him sink into a chair by the fire. "You faced them all." Griffin shook his head. "We did it. Your gamble with Patrick's journal was brilliant. Ruth smiled wryly. There is no journal, at least not one that mentions telegrams or bribes. Griffin stared at her in astonishment, then laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that transformed his face. You bluffed Harrison into revealing himself. Joseph grinned, holding up the leather-bound book. It's just Pa's old account book. Has some gambling debts written down, but nothing about Judge Harrison. The best lies contain elements of truth, Ruth explained. Patrick did keep records of his debts, and Harrison's reaction told us everything we needed to know. Remind me never to play poker with you, Mrs. McKenna, Isaiah chuckled. As the afternoon progressed, Deputy Wyatt brought news that Harrison had been seen leaving town in haste, taking only his personal belongings. The bank would be temporarily overseen by the county until a new manager could be appointed. Later that evening, while Ruth was helping the boys settle in Isaiah's spare room, Griffin found himself alone in a quiet corner of the blacksmith's shop. From his coat pocket, he withdrew the small wooden box carved with Clara's name, the repository of 3 years' worth of letters he'd never sent. He opened it carefully, fingers tracing the familiar edges worn smooth by daily handling. Inside lay dozens of folded pages, each one a conversation with a ghost, each bearing witness to his isolation and grief. Griffin lifted the final letter he'd written last night, the one where he'd first acknowledged the possibility of a future, of change. He read it again slowly, feeling the truth of those words in a way he hadn't fully understood when writing them. What do I do with these now, Clara? He whispered, not expecting an answer, yet somehow feeling her presence more clearly than he had in years. The answer came not in words but in understanding. These letters had been his lifeline when he couldn't bear to speak his pain aloud. They had kept Clara present when memories threatened to fade. They had served their purpose. With deliberate care, Griffin closed the box and set it aside. He wouldn't burn the letters. They were too precious, too honest. But neither would he continue the nightly ritual that had kept him tethered to grief. They would remain as testament to a chapter of his life, now gently closing. Goodbye, he said softly, touching the lid one last time. Not goodbye to Clara or James, they would always be part of him, but to the solitary man who had hidden on a mountainside, writing letters that were never meant to be read. When Ruth found him minutes later, she immediately sensed something had changed. Griffin's face appeared lighter somehow, as if a long-carried burden had shifted. Everything all right, she asked. Griffin nodded, glancing at the wooden box before meeting her eyes. Yes, he said with quiet certainty. I think it is. What happens now? Joseph asked as they shared a meal in Isaiah's quarters. Griffin looked at Ruth, the question in his eyes extending beyond the immediate future. What indeed? First, we ensure your mother's land is properly secured against any future claims, Griffin said, addressing Joseph but maintaining eye contact with Ruth. Then, he trailed off, leaving the possibilities unspoken between them. Later, as Isaiah entertained the younger boys with tales of his days as a buffalo soldier, Griffin and Ruth stepped outside into the clear winter evening. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the air crisp with frost. Will you return to your cabin? Ruth asked, the question that had hovered between them all day, finally finding voice. As Ruth and Griffin prepared to return inside, the door opened and Joseph stepped out, his serious young face thoughtful in the starlight. Ma, he said quietly, Nathan's asking for some water. Isaiah sent me to tell you. Ruth glanced between her son and Griffin, sensing something unspoken. I'll see to it, she said, giving Griffin's hand a final squeeze before slipping back inside. Joseph remained on the porch, hands thrust deep in his pockets against the cold. For a moment he stood in silence beside Griffin, both of them looking out at the night. Mr. Shaw, he finally said, did my father know? About the telegram, I mean. Did he understand what would happen? The question caught Griffin off guard. He considered it carefully, recognizing its importance to the boy. I don't believe so, Joseph. Your father made a mistake, a serious one, but I don't think he intended the harm that came from it. Joseph nodded slowly, processing this. He wasn't a good man, was he? Not like you. Griffin turned to the boy, surprised by the direct comparison. Joseph, it's not for me to judge your father. People are complicated, capable of both good and bad choices. But you wouldn't have left us in the storm, Joseph insisted. You wouldn't have hurt Ma. You helped people instead of hurting them. Griffin knelt to meet Joseph at eye level, seeing both the child and the man forming within him. I've made my share of mistakes too, Joseph. Running away to that mountain instead of facing life, that wasn't brave or good. Joseph studied him with eyes too knowing for his years. But you came back. You're helping us now. He hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been weighing on him. Are you going to stay? With us? I mean. The directness of the question, the vulnerability beneath it, moved Griffin deeply. This wasn't just about acceptance. It was about trust. About a boy who'd been disappointed by one father figure, daring to hope for better from another. I'd like to, Joseph, Griffin answered honestly. If you and your brothers would be all right with that. If your mother would be. Joseph's shoulders relaxed slightly. Then with a decisiveness that reminded Griffin of Ruth, he extended his hand. I'd be all right with it, sir. Griffin took the offered hand, recognizing the significance of this small, formal gesture from a boy who'd grown up too quickly. It wasn't just a handshake. It was permission. Acceptance. Thank you, Joseph, Griffin said, his voice rough with emotion. That means a great deal to me. The boy nodded once, then turned back toward the door. But he paused with his hand on the handle, adding quietly, I think James would be glad you're not alone anymore. Before Griffin could respond, Joseph had disappeared inside, leaving him standing in the starlight with the unexpected weight of a child's blessing on his shoulders. Griffin was silent for a long moment, looking toward the mountains where he had hidden for so long. I don't know, he admitted. Today has changed things. Fletcher mentioned that the town has been without a doctor since you left, Ruth said carefully. Many people asked if you might consider practicing again. Griffin's expression grew troubled. I don't know if I can, if I'm worthy of their trust after abandoning them. You didn't abandon them, Griffin. You were wounded, grieving, and now you are healing. He turned to her, his face visible in the soft light spilling from Isaiah's windows. Because of you and your sons. He hesitated, then added softly, especially you. The admission hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch. Ruth felt her heart quicken as Griffin continued. I've been thinking about what you said, about honoring memories without being imprisoned by them, about living fully rather than merely existing. His voice grew rougher. I don't know if I'm ready, Ruth, but I want to try to. Ruth understood the courage this admission required. This man who had locked away his heart as securely as he had locked his son's room, now tentatively opening both. We can try together, she suggested, one day at a time. Griffin's smile was tentative but real. I'd like that. The church bell rang in the distance, marking the hour. Tomorrow would bring decisions, arrangements, the practical matters of rebuilding lives. But tonight, standing beneath the winter stars, Ruth McKenna and Griffin Shaw had taken the first step on a new path, one neither had expected to find when a snowstorm brought them together. Inside, Matthew's laughter rang out at one of Isaiah's stories. Nathan's voice followed, asking an eager question. Joseph's quieter response came next, the sounds of family, of life continuing despite loss and struggle. Griffin listened, his expression softening. Shall we go back in? It's getting cold. Ruth nodded, but before they turned, she impulsively reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. After a moment's surprise, Griffin's hand closed around hers, warm and secure in the winter chill. Ruth, he said softly, his voice carrying a certainty that hadn't been there before. I've made a decision. She looked up at him, the question in her eyes. Tomorrow, I'm going to speak with the town council about reopening the medical practice. The words surprised him even as he spoke them, but they felt right, a weight lifting rather than settling upon him. Not in my old office, too many memories there, but perhaps a small clinic attached to the new building they're constructing on Pine Street. Ruth's eyes widened. Are you certain? That's a significant step. Griffin looked toward the mountains where his isolated cabin stood, then back to the warm light spilling from Isaiah's windows, where the boys' voices mingled. His face reflected the struggle and resolution of a man crossing an invisible threshold. Clara once told me that a gift unused is a gift wasted, he said. My medical training was never meant to be buried on that mountainside. He paused, his thumb gently tracing circles on the back of her hand. Besides, if we're to If we're considering a future here, the town needs a doctor, and perhaps I need to be one again. The unspoken promise in his words, we, future, here, hung between them, fragile and precious. Together they returned to the light and warmth, to the family that had begun to form between them, not replacing what was lost, but building something new from the fragments of broken dreams. And above them, the endless Wyoming sky sparkled with stars, indifferent to the small human dramas below, yet somehow bearing witness to the quiet miracle of heart's healing, of life renewing itself in the depths of winter. Spring came to Valley Springs with gentle persistence. Snow retreated up the mountainsides. Wildflowers appeared in sudden bursts of color, and the creek behind Griffin's cabin, now their cabin, broke free from ice with a triumphant rushing. 3 months had passed since the town meeting that had exposed Harrison's schemes. 3 months of careful steps forward, of building something neither Ruth nor Griffin had dared to imagine possible again. On this particular morning, Ruth stood on the porch, watching Griffin walk the property with Joseph. The two had developed an unexpected bond, the boy assisting in Griffin's newly reopened medical practice in town 2 days a week, learning to prepare bandages and organize supplies with serious dedication. "They're talking about the addition again," Nathan reported, appearing beside her with a wooden horse Griffin had carved him. "Joseph wants the new rooms to face the sunrise." Ruth smiled. The cabin was becoming too small for their growing family. Not just physically, though that was true enough, but symbolically. Their lives were expanding beyond the boundaries grief had once imposed. Inside, the door to James's room stood open. No longer a shrine, no longer locked. It had become Matthew's room 2 months ago. James's toys and books remained, but now mingled with Matthew's drawings and the small treasures young boys collect. Griffin had made the decision one evening without fanfare, simply unlocking the door, sitting quietly in the room for an hour, then asking Matthew if he might like a room of his own. The town, too, had changed. With Harrison gone, a weight had lifted. Reverend Fletcher preached about forgiveness and new beginnings with the fervor of a man who had experienced both. The railway eventually came, rerouted slightly, benefiting multiple landowners rather than one corrupt judge. Isaiah's forge was busier than ever. Griffin's medical practice occupied the front room of what had once been the telegraph office. Twice weekly, he treated everything from minor injuries to chronic ailments, his skills returning with each patient. The rest of his time he spent with Ruth and the boys, building a life measured not by what had been lost, but by what had been found. "Mama," Matthew called from inside. "Dr. Griffin says we can visit the graves today." It had become a Sunday ritual, tending the graves of Clara and James, bringing fresh wildflowers. The boys asking questions about the woman and child they'd never met, but who had become, somehow, part of their extended family. Griffin answered those questions with increasing ease, memories now bringing more comfort than pain. Later that evening, after the boys had gone to sleep, Ruth found Griffin at his desk, a blank sheet of paper before him. "No letter tonight?" she asked softly. Griffin shook his head, turning to her with clear eyes. "No need anymore. I think Clara knows." Ruth sat beside him, taking his hand. The wooden box that had held his letters to Clara now contained different treasures. Matthew's first drawing for Griffin, a river stone Joseph had given him, a chess piece Nathan had carved under his tutelage. Mementos of the present, not just the past. "The deed came today," Griffin said, producing an official-looking paper. "The land is now in both our names." Ruth studied the document, their shared future made legal and binding. Next month would bring another document, a marriage certificate, making official what their hearts had already decided. "Are you happy?" she asked, the question simple yet profound. Griffin's answer came not in words, but in the gentle kiss he placed on her palm, in the quiet certainty of his embrace as the Wyoming night deepened around their home. This place of second chances, of healing found in the most unexpected of snowstorms. Outside, spring winds whispered through pine boughs. Inside, 4 souls slept beneath one roof, while 2 others, Ruth liked to think, kept gentle watch from beyond the stars.